Welcome to URL Unzip, Reboot, and Leave, a podcast about the psychology that moves us. Through real conversations with thinkers, doers, and seekers, we explore how we adapt, evolve, and find meaning. So let's unzip, reboot, and leave. Welcome to another exciting episode of Unzip, Reboot, and Leave URL podcast. Today we are joined by a rare voice, a thinker who connects climate, dignity, and power, a strategist shaped by journalism, policy, and service. He believes the future economy must serve humanity, not market, not power, but people, planet, and purpose together. Please welcome global humanist and climate strategist Satya Brata Das. How are you, Satya?
Very good, Gautam, and thank you for having me on your podcast. I must admit it's the first one I've done for Australia, although I do have quite a number of Australian colleagues in Melbourne and Canberra and elsewhere. So I hope they'll be able to recognize something of their home country as we go through.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so you are a global humanist and climate strategist, but you
That's
have,
that's awfully grand, you know. That's awfully grand and a bit pompous, actually. I'm just sort of a ordinary fellow who's spent his life trying to think how we can have a better world.
right. So that is from like a human perspective, right? Rather than
Very
engineering or
much so,
anything
very
like
much so. I mean, it's always been about really finding a better way to leave no one behind and to have a kind of world that works for everybody. And a lot of times that seems completely out of reach. Here we are in the first weeks of 2026. The first quarter of this millennium hasn't gone particularly well, first quarter of the century. We've had all sorts of turmoil and recidivism of all sorts in terms of global affairs. And geopolitics right now is in a complete flux. We're in the middle of a climate crisis. People are questioning democracy. People feel completely, no matter what kind of society they're in, people often feel powerless and hopeless and unable to change things that are larger forces above them. So, if we thought that the pandemic was a pause that would give us a bit of a lesson, a chance to recalibrate, well, it did all of that for about 10 days. And then the world was back to normal. Where once we reveled at the sight of blue skies and being able to see mountains, we were back to choking pollution. We were back to the fossil fuel era in a big way. And in a sense, ever since the geopolitical strife caused by the pandemic, we didn't learn the lesson that all the bristling arsenals of the world cannot protect you against a virus that's invisible to the naked eye. That should have taught us collectively a sense of humility. It certainly did to individuals, but it did not do that necessarily to those who hold power and those who are still consumed by the power structures of the past instead of looking to see what lessons did we learn and what can we apply. And that's why I'm offering you and every other listener and reader you may have the Manifesto of Hope. This is my answer to say that despair is a luxury we cannot afford. There are untold stories. The largest untold story is how capital is flowing toward the green transition, despite the many obstacles in its way. How capital, with all its neutrality, actually sees green investment opportunities as being much more lucrative than fossil fuel ones, even as political leadership tries to turn back the clock and insists that we cannot give up the fossil fuel age and that we must continue to build larger arsenals, having learned nothing from the virus that brought life on Earth to a standstill.
so that means what a capital actually heading us towards, you are basically saying, okay, hang on, there are better way we can use the capital. Is that the economic angle to it?
That's part of it, but it's part of an untold story. The untold story really begins in 1987, which is when the United Nations released a landmark report called Our Common Future. It was chaired by the then Prime Minister of Norway, Dr. Gro Harlem Brundtland, who then went on after that to become the executive director of the World Health Organization. And in her role as chair of that report and in the World Health Organization, she introduced an idea that was simple in its radicalism. She defined sustainability as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the needs of the future. Beautiful, elegant structure. Now, once you plant a revolutionary seed like that, it takes years and decades to take root. You keep on trying the alternatives. You keep on trying absolutism of power. But then you understand that what we have done to ourselves, the climate catastrophe we have wrought upon the earth, is, in fact, a failure to respect the laws of nature, that we have broken our sacred covenant with Mother Earth, and that in a sense, we have now before us the opportunity to restore the frayed boundaries and to try to make the planet livable again. It's not going to be an easy task. We've missed the critical deadline, the critical target of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. That's gone, that's breached. So now it's a question of adaptation, resilience, and mitigation. The foundation for all of this was laid by the United Nations philosophy articulated by Brundtland, but now the flow of capital, the flow of money is starting to make that come true. A lot of that is not driven by what you would consider as a traditional capitalist economy. The big green shift actually began in China. In about 2008, 2009, when Hu Jintao was the general secretary of the Communist Party and de facto leader of the country, there was a consensus within the Chinese leadership. How do we dominate the future economy? And they decided to pursue what they call ecological civilization. At that time, the green transition was piecemeal. The world had just come through the 2008-9 financial crisis caused by the meltdown of really dodgy junk bond mortgages in the United States that nearly brought the world economy to its knees. So, in that chaotic scenario, China looked for a different path out of the rubble. And it decided to go all hands on deck, top to bottom, in the pursuit of what called ecological civilization. Everybody from the central bank to their astonishing ability to command state industries around a national purpose, all of their pursuits were leading to the green transition. Now, at the same time, China was burning fossil fuels because it had an all of the above energy strategy. But that momentum that started by China has now led China to a place of planetary dominance when it comes to manufacturing and installing the hardware of the green transition. Solar panels, electric vehicles, batteries, rare earth minerals. This is what is giving China a predominance in the global economy. Later to the game, India came along about 2010, a couple of years later, starting with the prime ministership of Manmohan Singh and continuing under Narendra Modi, just as Xi Jinping continued Hu Jintao's beginnings. And now you see India with its democratic tradition from its bottom up, complementing China's top down state command approach, but together between them, they are shaping the green future. And in 2025, August, India announced that half of its installed electricity generating capacity now came from renewables. Quite astonishing. China's on its way to go there. And then you have other countries that are in between. So the capital is following this leadership.
What you were saying, like there is a scientist, Partho Dasgupta, he describes that biodiversity is an asset. So, in that spirit, how can natural assets basically can be valued as consumer or resources in this global scale of economy?
Well, actually, Partho's thinking is quite critical because biodiversity loss, pollution, and the climate crisis are considered the triple crises of the natural world. You couple that with corruption and conflict, and now you have a polycrisis. So it's the confluence of climate, corruption, and conflict that really are the source and the genesis of the huge problem we have to solve. And it's almost as though we sometimes feel that our capacity to cope is outrunning the capacity of our systems, because what we have is the scale of the catastrophe is so huge. Do we have the human systems to get there? And that's a big part of the Manifesto of Hope, telling the untold story of the green transition, telling the untold story of the impact the Brundtland report has had, and essentially telling the untold story of how spending on planetary defense, which I define as the green transition elements we just talked about, is now approaching spending on military defense. In 2025, the world spent 2.4 trillion US dollars on military defense, 2.1 trillion on planetary defense. Look at the contrast. Of that military defense spending, more than $900 billion came from the United States alone. Of planetary defense, nearly $900 billion came from China alone. So here you have the supposedly Communist Party of China taking a capitalist approach to diversifying the global economy, and you have the supposedly democratic government of the United States ramping up military might and defense spending and basically threatening those who go against its interests. It's almost a complete turnaround of what you'd expect those labels to mean, but there we are.
Now, everything, because I'm also from India, you are also from India. In India, we call it, okay, there are a lot of people, we are not that rich country, etc., etc. But what you are saying, how much is literally the money and how much is the thought process and the leadership? Because what I'm hearing, money, yes, it is necessary, but it's just a part of it. There is a massive
It's all
space.
about thinking and leadership, and it's all about thinking. Uh, India's attitudes and China's attitudes are both deeply influenced by what we might call Asian origin philosophies. If you strip away the communist overlay over Chinese civilization, it is essentially Confucian, Taoist, and Buddhist. India's traditions are largely Hindu and Buddhist. Each of those faith traditions, like all the others that came later, place a premium on human humility in the face of the natural world. Living in harmony with nature, living in harmony within your community, never consuming so much that you're more than a steward of the collective wealth we have inherited from our ancestors. These are all ingrained into the DNA of 40% of humanity. When you think of that, it's this philosophical foundation that's driving everything. One of the pivotal moments of the world recently was an astonishing trio of meetings in 2023. First, you had the G20 summit, which was the Indian presidency, built around the theme of one world, one family, one future. Then we had the World Bank meetings in Morocco that year, a month later, in which essentially the leaders of the global community and the global South, which through the African Union had recently joined the G20 group of countries, really decided that the model of ecological civilization was absolutely essential. And then later that year, at the COP conference, toward the end of the year, for the first time, you had the creation of what was called a loss and damage fund, which really enabled countries of the global South, countries adversely affected by climate change, to have access to some equity. Now, when we get into the Manifesto of Hope, there's a lot of technical detail on the new financial architecture, the financial plumbing, all these structures that exist that you need to retool and rethink to make it happen. But the fact is that if you're taking the what I call the ARM doctrine, adaptation, resilience, and mitigation, this includes everything from measures to protect the safety of investments to measures to protect the safety of human populations. And whatever superficial turbulence we see because of geopolitics, the misery in the world will never stop. And I always tell my friends, when they worry about this war or that war or this bombing or that genocide or this starvation or this, and they say, why? I say, note these things, but don't take it to heart because you will run out of heart long before the world runs out of misery. So we have to stay resolute and focused and look at what is actually working. And we also come to realize now that politicians are generally frozen and paralyzed by the many forces tugging at them. They can go to international meetings, make grand promises, but they get home, a number of crises pile up, and all the noble policies are dashed on the rocks of unyielding domestic reality. So, where does that really leave us? In countries where we are able to organize, and this isn't just democracies, because even authoritarian systems have a level of citizen engagement, we have to convene ourselves around solutions that will make it easy and comfortable for the political leaders to join the parade. Don't wait for the politicians to start the parade. Start it yourself and make it comfortable for them to join.
In this frame, how much is too much or how much is required? How you are defining it? Because greed is
You
always
start with the
taking over.
local, you start with the local to take it global. Because one of the reasons you feel overwhelmed is not just because of mass communication and the digital age in which everyone has an opinion and there's no filtered news anymore, there's no curated news, and the world is fragmenting into these little self-reinforcing bubbles of belief. You work with what you can actually shape. What you can shape is your local sphere of influence. If you work globally like me, I'm on a number of boards and committees and all of that. It's the people you know. You start with the people you know. You start with your physical community and your virtual communities, and you start convening people around the basics of what it means to have a human-centered economy, to what it means to really strive for a world that will have better human and planetary outcomes. And now that we've reached planetary limits and planetary boundaries, the existential fight to do what we need to do to bring our societies to a position of humility vis-a-vis nature rather than the human hubris that we can always conquer it. Before the pandemic, in March 2019, the global school strike for climate really raised awareness when you had about 30 million children across the world in so many countries organized by social media uttering a simple slogan: follow the science. Follow the science. Now, it didn't have any immediate visible effects, but it permeated and filtered and rippled throughout society. Those children of 2019 are actually young adults now. They're starting to come into positions of power. And finally, because the frameworks laid by China and India and others, the European Commission, which even though sometimes it's fragmented, very much on that side, you're now seeing capital is also following the science because it knows it leads to money. My Prime Minister, Mark Carney, when he was the chief of UN climate finance before he came into politics, convened something called the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which is called GFANZ. Mark managed to amass $130 trillion of private capital, $130 trillion to invest in the green future. Now, what's stopping that investment is how do you make sure those investments are safe? How do you make sure there's a return? So now we know that because of GFANZ, there's no shortage of capital. Now we have to put the structures in place to ensure that capital can be properly deployed. Just knowing that and having that kind of knowledge is a powerful, powerful convening point. It means that recipient countries have to clean up their act. They have to get rid of corruption. They have to embrace transparent banking laws. They have to invest in safeguards. And so, all of these things, it's a mutually reinforcing system. Once you know the capital is there, you create investable opportunities. So, from a straight business and capital viewpoint, it can be done. The other thing that Mark managed to convince people, because it's absolutely true, is that climate transition, energy transition, the green future isn't a charity. It's a multi-trillion-dollar economic profit center. China was the first to recognize this with its investment in ecological civilization. India has followed suit. India is now committed to being the greatest exporter of green molecules by 2030, whether it's in the sense of either renewable electricity, green hydrogen, or other sort of innovations. China has committed to the democratization of electricity. What do I mean by the democratization of electricity? It has nothing to do with political democracy. It means that the price of solar panels has fallen so low now that instead of having these massive national grids that are interlinked and vulnerable to military or terrorist attack, you can have rooftop microgeneration in the hundreds of millions. You create local grids, local networks that are much more resilient, clusters of energy that don't depend on a huge central provider, and it's affordable. This is what I mean by the democratization of electricity. In fact, we can see looking in 2026, the next 5 years ahead, fossil fuels will have their last death throes. They will be an asset for a number of years. I won't predict how many, but the age of electricity is here because renewables are going to be the future. That's clearly understood now all across the world, even though it's resisted by some power structures, particularly in the United States.
I was reading somewhere where it says that if we can increase the power generation and make all the deserts into a green land, that can change the whole dynamics. Is it a very far-fetched aspiration or can be
It's
actionable?
already happening.
It is happening a little bit, but in a mass scale.
Not a little bit. It's happening in a huge way. In the
Okay.
Rajasthan and Gujarat desert, a 15,000 megawatt generation capacity has been installed in one installation. China is on a similar scale. The Indian and Chinese solar parks and wind energy parks, the combined industry, they're only limited by battery storage and transmission capacity. So what's happening now? Industries that can immediately use that source of power are springing up all around. We are so quickly moving to that. And a lot of this is also driven by the need for data centers and the electricity they consume. We are now learning how to make nuclear power safe through modular nuclear reactors rather than massive complexes that again are prone to attack or some sort of meltdown. So within the next 10 years, you will see the age of electricity really come to fruition. Now, at the same time, that doesn't mean that in geopolitics, the last defenders of fossil fuels, like the current administration in the United States, will take extraordinary measures to try to preserve that dominance. But that is a short-lived window. This is what gives me hope for the planetary transition. And this is why in the Manifesto of Hope, I want to tell the story of the future that's already emerging, even though it's hidden under the chaos of cruelty and misery and war.
Hmm. Finance and technology, these are often described as value neutral tools. But often, especially the country we from, we we can't see those kind of approach in normal, basic, mundane human life. So how can we consciously embed, I mean, ethics or belonging or trust into a system, in this value neutral tool? Is there
That's a
any thought of that?
that's a fantastic question, Gautam. And actually, the thing is that I would not use the phrase value neutral. I would just say these are tools. Okay, finance is a tool. Finance carries real power with it. Technology is a tool. It can be used for good. It can be used for evil. The same technology that creates nuclear bombs can also eventually power large cargo ships. So when you look at it in different ways, then it depends on what sort of human societies you build that are going to deploy these tools wisely. Now, in China and India, you have two completely different systems, but they each have huge populations, they each have huge resources, and they're two of the top three economies in the world. So when you go by purchasing power, China has been number one since 2015, eclipsing the United States, and India has been number three. It's only if you use the nominal GDP of exchange rates and economic output that way that the US remains on top, which is an artificial construct based on exchange rates. But when you see what the money will actually buy, China and India are the number one and the number three economies of the world. Now, how their political systems respond, how they evolve, what are the checks and balances, that's where the citizen leadership comes in. That's where ordinary people have a capacity. Now, in India, there may be more scope of it because of a nominally democratic system, regional rivalries, checks and balances that are done on a regional basis, on an ethnic basis, and a cultural basis. But in China, you also have a party structure that's especially resilient, receptive now to any sign of popular discontent. It does not want any discontent that gets out of control. So when there were protests against the COVID repression in China, China just overnight shut that down, said, okay, restrictions are gone, we're declaring it safe, just as they declared an emergency. Now, when you have two completely different political systems that more or less have a broad consensus on what the direction of public investment in the economic future will be, it is an interesting construct. In India, the inequity, which is a worldwide phenomenon, in societal development is much more visible because it's reported and it's not suppressed and it's evident. In more authoritarian countries, this kind of dissent is often swept under the rug. I mean, we really have no idea what goes on in societies where you don't have freedom of expression. We really don't, no matter how economically successful they may be. It's better to come to grips with your problems, warts and all, to recognize what they are, and to realize what you have to do to put a check on power. And the checks are sometimes global, they're not just local. I mean, I know that in India for a time there was a sort of almost a virulent program to quell Muslims and the Islamic faith by some political leaders. But that got tamped down by the fact that India's biggest source of investment are the Muslim countries of the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. So, if you're going to keep the confidence of that investment, then you have to be, to put it in a very basic term, less beastly to the people you wanted to oppress. So that's almost sort of a global check and balance. It doesn't mean that all injustice is gone, but it's a tempering. So it's not just local actions. So the irony now, as the United States goes around kidnapping the rulers of other countries and taking over their oil reserves, as it did in the first weeks of 2026, it's certainly the supreme irony that China is going around the world now proclaiming itself as the keeper of the rules-based international order. So checks and balances everywhere. And ultimately, it's up to citizens who live in societies where you still have the power to organize and the power to express yourself and freedom of assembly to start really defining and articulating what they want and getting it there.
Hmm. Hmm. But one thing, this is just my personal question, is like developing countries where for anything and everything they penetrate politics into it. For example, in India, in local level, how, I mean, how we can penetrate all these thought process into those who are actually working there? Will it just transform through money, or because no way we
That's a
can
work in
change everything?
progress.
Yeah.
That's really a work in progress,
Okay.
and
And it
it's
will
a
take like few decades, or
place of safety and security. It will not go into zones of instability. And the lessons over time, certainly in the Indian experience, is that the more stable a region is, the more likely it is to attract the kind of investment it needs and the kind of social uplifting it needs. You really have to start with the miracle that China achieved, which in the last 20 years has been to lift 850 million people out of poverty into something like a life worth living. That process is slower in India. It might be getting there, but generally all over the world, those are sort of two examples of large countries. But let's look at the countries of Western Europe, all the middle powers, all of the developing world. The problem of inequity is there. You have people in very fancy cars going by people who are living on the streets. The number of homeless people in the richest countries of the world is unsustainable. Uh, there was a British government report last year that said a third of British school children live in poverty and go to school hungry. So, if the richest countries of the world can't solve inequality, then we realize that what we described at the beginning of the conversation, this whole disaffection and feeling of powerlessness, is really driven by that feeling of inequity. So, the equality problem, the equity problem, is the first one that needs to be societally addressed. And that'll only be addressed by a human centered economy, not by one that puts profit ahead of all else. One of the Esther Duflo and Ovijit Banerjee, who continued Amartya Sen's groundbreaking word in the economics of poverty, all came to realize that giving actually economic power and agency to the lowest economic strata of the population has a far greater effect than government subsidies from the top or to those who are absolutely already successful. This empowerment and agency is sort of embodied in what is evident in conversations I've had with central bankers and diplomats from Africa, not looking for charity, not looking for a handout, looking for investment. Africa has more resources than any other continent in the world. By definition, it should be the richest part of the world. But decades of colonialism, decades of post colonial corruption, not to put too fine a point on it, decades of conflict have sapped that potential. Now there's an urgency now in the face of opportunity, especially presented by the climate crisis, to leapfrog many of the standard economic development tools of the past half century. So if you consider that half of the African continent doesn't have electricity, it can go straight from the non-existence of fossil fuel electricity to the existence of renewable energy electricity, whether it's rooftop solar or large desert installations. Having that kind of agency and autonomy is astonishing. Green hydrogen is about to become economically viable. So, in a country like Mauritania, for instance, a desert country of 5 million people that occupies a huge swath of sort of the northeast corner of Africa, you're going to get green hydrogen projects underwritten by the European Union that are going to produce 50 million liters of clean drinking water a day, which, in terms of economic development, basic empowerment, is really huge. Clean water, clean air, basic health care, basic education, these are the societal building blocks that nobody can ignore. These are the basic building blocks that successful societies that have transitioned from poverty to an equitable life that works for most people have pursued. Look at the power of education in post-independence India. Before 1947, India was largely princely states, peasants, and a small band of merchants. Now, look at the fact that most of the modern world technology, the AI, the digital age, the whole power of computers and networking has had a significant, I would say, an outsized influence of Indian minds and Indian origin people, no matter what nationality they might now hold, running these things. Would any of this have had happened if post-independence India had not invested in mass education? That's not to say that education in India is great or perfect. I mean, there is an elite level and then at sometimes a really awful level. But when you get to the people who are able to crack the elite level, the difference they've already made in the world is quite astonishing.
So you have helped shape the digital economist framework for a human-centric global economy in Canada. So can you?
Actually, no, 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 that was there's a brilliant young woman called Navroop Sadev who was a product of an Indian university who got a straight scholarship to Harvard Kennedy Business School. So Navroop, at the age of 24 or 25, decided to launch a think tank that was dedicated to a human-centered economy. She headquartered it in Washington, D.C. She called it the Digital Economist. I had the good fortune to help her on her journey for a couple of years. I ran her Center of Excellence on a Human-Centered Economy. I was then the first global chair of that organization. And then sort of I moved on, and Navroop has gone from success to success. So the digital economist is really her baby. And she is one of these amazing examples of not just young Indians, but young Indian women. I believe she's still under 35 who are changing the world in quite astonishing ways. So I wouldn't want to say that I had anything else than a mentorship and or an avuncular role in that. But it was great because we were able to convene a lot of great action.
So what are the core principles, if you can explain a little bit on it?
And the human-centered economy was actually came out of Amartya Sen's work on the economics of poverty and on overcoming all of that. And
Right.
that has been a part of the economics transition, even before Amartya won all of the accolades that he won, and even before Ovijit and Nestor also won the Nobel Prize. The whole idea of empowering the most marginalized people has been a resonant theme in economics. When you look at Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century, for instance, I mean, all of these trends are there. It's not the concentration of capital, it's the democratization of economic power that really drives change and drives the world. When you look at how after Deng Xiaoping became the supreme leader of China and he unleashed China from what was the centrally planned yoke and actually enabled individual enterprise to flourish, it's quite astonishing. The way India lifted itself out of poverty was not more top-down government programs. It came when Manmohan Singh, after his spell as the governor of the Reserve Bank of India, became the Indian finance minister about 37 or 38 years ago. And at that time, he essentially lifted so many of the restrictions, reformed the taxation system, and really unleashed the entrepreneurial spirit of India. Now, despite the mega projects now and the big corporations that dominate, more than 80% of India's wealth comes from small and medium enterprises. It might come from someone who started off with a street cart where they were frying samosas, and now they have 20 of those street carts doing it. So taking a successful economic model and upscaling it. When you travel anywhere in India now, it's astonishing how the ubiquity of the India Stack, the digital payment system, is. You'll see vegetable sellers with gunny sacks who have a little plastic card there. So there's no money exchanged. You make your purchase, you flash your phone at it, and the vendor gets paid. This sort of digital democracy, which is now also being adopted within the African Union and within some European countries, is huge. So you have two huge democratizing movements. First is the democratization of electricity, so the Chinese hardware of solar panels. Then you have the democratization of finance through this universal payment system that really makes it easy for people who previously didn't even have a bank account to able to transact money digitally and safely. And the same with the farmer who brought the gunny sack to the street side market. They can go on their app in the morning and find out which wholesale market is offering the best prices and make their decisions on that. This is what economic democratization looks like. And you need more of it. And quite frankly, you need to get political structures out of the way. I won't say get government out of the way because government is actually important. Government is central and vital to keeping order, to providing social services, to providing basic security. What it's not good at is coming up with a whole maze of regulations that say why you won't be able to do it, as
Mm.
to why are we preventing people from doing this. So this is the mentality that's changed, certainly in India over the last 20 years. Why can't the coconut seller keep on selling his green coconuts by you flashing the phone at him? You know, when you start changing your mindset to allow these kinds of things to happen, then everything in society starts to come up.
Right. So we are almost in the last phase of it, and especially in this era of fragmentation and anxiety, you mentioned many things. Based on your the Hope Manifesto, what does hope mean to you, and how can we make it more actionable?
Okay, for me, the Manifesto of Hope, which will be out in September 2026, by the way. So thank you for doing the first interview for the book
Oh,
because we're
wow.
still about
Thank you.
9 months away from it. Really goes back to the whole recognition that we are one humanity. And that is based on part of my Hindu philosophical tradition, which in English should be called non-dualism. It doesn't mean that we are one in unity, it means we are not two. That's a very subtle distinction in Advaita philosophy. We are not two. What does that mean? We don't have two planets. We don't have two species of Homo sapiens. That's the underlying unity. What we need to do is to understand the power that's inherent in us as citizens to start restoring the links that bind us, to look up from our screens and to actually find community. Now, sometimes you find community through our screens, as we are right now with this podcast. But more often, it's reaching to create the circles, the communities, and being active within that community, much as you are by hosting this podcast. I mean, here you are with a varied background in business and enterprise and startups and all that. And as you were telling me before we began this interview, at a certain point, you came to realize that we have to talk to each other. We have to find each other. We have to reach out to each other. And you never know the kind of impact these conversations will have. So the green transition is going to be led both from the top down and the bottom up. And at some point, in that meeting point of the top down of those with power and those with money and those with capital, they will meet a community that will guide them as to the best deployment of that power and authority. That's what gives me hope, despite the daily turbulence and chaos we see. I say the daily turbulence is like the typhoon on the surface of the sea. Go 10 meters down below the surface and see what's really happening. That's what the Manifesto of Hope brings to the table. And Gautam, I thank you very much for having me on your podcast, and I'll be happy to come back anytime.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Shotada, for your time.